In architectural photography and real estate photography, one of the most important skills that you can learn is being able to combine the bright exteriors with the darker interiors and combine that convincingly into one photo. And in this tutorial, I'm going to share with you exactly how to get the very best results from what I consider to be the premium gold standard technique that you have to know if you want to get the very best out of your luminosity blending. High quality HDR work and the Flambient technique are both excellent solutions to this problem of combining the interior with the exterior. And while on occasions I will be using both of those techniques, if you want to get the very best results, you have to get a handle on luminosity blending. Not only am I going to cover and simplify the steps involved, but I'll also do a bit of troubleshooting as well for those of you that have tried this technique before but end up with less than satisfactory results, often a much flatter image than you were hoping for. So the first part of the process comes down to preparing your raw files properly. I'm going to be working in Lightroom, but any raw editor that you want to work with is absolutely fine as long as we end up with our photos inside of Photoshop. So let's do that step first. In this example, I am just working with these 3 shots, but usually when I'm on site, I do actually shoot 5 exposures, sometimes 7, just to make sure I'm covering my bases. But then in post-production, I will usually only use 3 exposures, one that deals with the base exposure, giving me a foundation for the photo, then one that deals with the highlights, and then one that is used just to bring back the shadow detail. So the first thing we want to do is just do some quick editing on these photos and get them set up ready for the luminosity blending. And so I'm going to do this fairly quickly because I've gone over this stuff in other videos. A camera flat profile brings us a little bit more dynamic range, which is a great starting place. I've got this on auto sync, so any changes I make to this photo will also be applied to the darker exposure and also the brighter exposure as well. So the easiest way to deal with this is work top down in Lightroom and work our way through these. I'm not going to make all of the adjustments that I may usually make. I just want to get this done quickly so that we can actually focus more on the actual luminosity blending side of things. So the first thing that I'd like to do is set a custom white balance. Now I've clicked on the ceiling here. If you've got a white ceiling, that's normally a good place to start. But in this instance, because we have a brown wooden floor, we're going to be getting a lot of bounce light off of that, which will be creating a natural orange cast on the ceiling. So going for that is giving us more of a blue look than we would want. And so what I'm going to do here is actually look at the number that I'm given by clicking on a neutral target on the ceiling. That's giving me this 4650 plus 27. If I go back to the as shot, I can see this is 5550 and plus 16. So I feel like this is too warm. I felt the other one was too cool. And so when I have situations like this, I'll just split the difference. So let's go for 5150 and we'll just bump this up a little bit. Let's go plus 20 on that. And there you go. We have a much more natural white balance based on what the camera thought when we were on site and from what Lightroom thought by me sampling up here. So currently we have this white balance set across all 3. We want to make sure that we don't have any variation in our white balance between the exposures that we're bringing together. Now this photo is slightly underexposed, so I am going to bump this up, and normally I'd have a correct exposure for this. Like I said, I've only got 3 shots here, and originally I would have had 5. I don't know what happened to the other ones, but for this video purposes, this is going to be absolutely fine. And normally for my highlights, shadows and whites and blacks, I will create this sort of D shape where we're dropping the highlights and the blacks, not too excessively, and the shadows and the whites will get boosted up, something like this. From here I'll jump into the clarity and just boost that up, somewhere around plus 10 is fine. A little bit of dehaze, not too much, because I find that if we push that too far, we're introducing some rather odd color shifts in the image, so I don't normally like to do that. If we want to add localized contrast and things like that, we do that later in the process. But one thing I do like to do is just increase the color saturation and vibrancy just a little bit. It's nice to have slightly richer colors to work with because we can always dial them back down later. Now I've jumped into the tone curve here, and often I will find that a little bump in the mid-tones goes a long way. Because if we look at the distribution of the brightness values, the luminosity, you'll see that we actually have a lot of data around the left-hand side of the graph. So I'm just going to put a point here and just boost this up slightly, because the areas of a property that you would think should be white are actually often a mid-grey. So if I reset this and we come with this targeted picker tool, if I just hover over here, you can see that on the line of the curve, we actually see where this brightness value exists. And as I hover this over the ceiling, which is a white ceiling, you can actually see that we're pretty much bang in the middle of our curve. And so if I click, hold, and now drag up. We're just going to brighten up that area, and that's also going to brighten up our interior, which is going to help us as well. Might not go quite that high for this one. Let's go something like that. I'm now just going to skip straight over color grading, and the detail section as well, and just jump straight into the hugely important lens correction section, because that is going to save us from all manner of sins of our lens. So we're going to remove the chromatic aberration, and even more visually impactful is clicking enable profile correction. So you'll see the big change between how it was before and how it is after. We're getting rid of all of that barrel distortion. So we're about halfway to correcting the really heinous lens distortion that this 16-35 gives me. It's a beautiful, sharp lens. However, you do get a lot of distortion, and here I'm tilted down. So the next step is correcting for that tilt, which is really easy to do through the transform section. My preference for this tool is to use the guidelines because you're in control of that perspective. However, in this case, I'm pretty sure Lightroom has indeed done a good job just by clicking the vertical button here. But one thing I've noticed, just judging by my eye, is things have got a little bit pinched, and so grabbing the aspect slider, we can actually correct for this. So you can take things one way or the other, and in this case I just need to take it just a little bit to the left just to get those proportions back where they need to be. So this was our before and this was our after. And in terms of correcting your architectural photos, that transform tool goes a really long way to getting them looking so much better. So if we consider where we started with that raw file to where we actually ended up right now, I consider those to be the absolute basics, the fundamentals of editing architectural photography. However, we want to take things the next step, and it's this part that is really important if you want to get believable luminosity blending going on. So if we're taking that bright exterior, the darker interior, and seamlessly blending it to one photo, pay attention to this bit. It's all about the image preparation that sets us up for success in the next step. So let's take a look. So all of these global changes that we've made so far to the photos have been applied with auto sync turned on. So every change to this base layer has also been made to the highlights layer and to the layer that we're going to use to bring in detail in the shadows as well. But that doesn't mean that these were the best settings for the highlights and the shadows layer. Our primary concern thus far has just been making sure that we match the color balance between the three photos and also the geometry in the scene, so that when we blend these together in Photoshop, everything's going to line up beautifully. So I'm going to deselect these by pressing Ctrl D on the keyboard, and now I'm just going to select one photo, and I'm just going to edit this base layer and make sure that I'm happy with that. So I'm going to scroll back up all the way to the basic section here and just do a little bit of fine tuning. So I am just going to boost the exposure up, add just a little bit of contrast, and also add some more detail into the shadows. Now this photo comes from my Nikon D850, which has a fantastic sensor with over 14 stops of dynamic range. So that's a lot of difference between the very darkest shadows and the very brightest highlights. So you might be thinking, well, why don't you just process this one photo and that'd be good enough? Because there is a lot of detail in the highlights that we can bring back. So let me show you why you wouldn't really want to do this if you're wanting to deliver to your client the very highest quality work. But this quick hack that I'll show you may actually suffice for real estate delivery or just getting your proofs back to your client, but for that highest level, it's not what we want to do. I'll show you why. So I'll just bring the exposure back down just a little bit, and now we can boost the shadows, so we're getting effectively the same sort of look on the interior. We can also boost up the blacks as well, and now we're just going to control the highlights. So I'm just going to drop those highlights back down, and you can see that in fact we do have a whole lot of dynamic range available to us. Sure, we've got a very flat looking image at the moment, but we can counteract that by boosting up the contrast here. We could also do that in the tone curve if we wanted, and then to control that, because it's got oversaturated, just drop that saturation down. You may think, well, that's pretty good and it saved me a lot of time. I'll send that back to my client. And yes, that might be good enough for a proof. But if you look outside, we don't have the visual depth in the highlights, the colors are pretty underwhelming, and even more so, if we come down into the shadow areas, let's say we just boost this up just a little bit more so we can see into those shadows, you can actually see all of the noise that we're dealing with. And if you're expecting to get paid well for this type of work, your client should be expecting to receive a high quality file, and digital noise in the shadows like this just isn't of that highest caliber that I like to deliver to my clients, and I don't think you should either. On this channel, I've got no no qualms talking about pricing, and usually you guys say it's helping you out. So this job, for instance, this was worth over $4,500 to me, partly because I supplied the files to the architect and the builder, and that made up the final bill. So I feel that if you're delivering that type of invoice to somebody, you also need to be delivering work of the highest standard, and that is why we're doing this luminosity blending approach rather than just the quick fix that I've shown you here. So let's press on. So what am I looking for when I make adjustments to the base layer? So effectively, all I want is a really well exposed interior. I want a nice amount of contrast. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be extreme because I can build contrast in later, but I just want this interior to be looking pretty good. I don't want it underexposed. I don't want it overexposed. It's the Goldilocks principle. I want it just right. Now, in terms of the brightness, the fact that the highlights are blowing out outside of the window, that's actually a good thing. Look, if I turn our warnings on by clicking the little triangle in the top right of the histogram there, we can see that we've gone to pure white pretty much everywhere outside. And that's actually in our benefit because that's going to help us bring back in the darker exposure. This highlights layer here, it's going to help us bring that back in much more easily in Photoshop. So what I can do is actually grab the white slider and actually boost that up even more, because watch what happens if I drop it all the way down and we look just at the interior of the lounge here. Everything just gets a little bit tepid, a little bit washed out. But when I grab the whites and boost that up, we actually get a little bit more of an interesting contrast going on here. So I'm not afraid to push those whites quite high on this base layer. For the blacks, I just like to position those literally where we just start to creep in on the side of the histogram here. So I'm going to turn the warning dialog on again so you guys can see exactly where we're clipping, thanks to those little blue warnings. And basically I just bring that up literally until we just start to get the blue showing up just here. Okay, let's turn our clipping warnings off just by pressing the J key on the keyboard. And now we can see the base layer for what it is. And for me, this is pretty much perfect for bringing into Photoshop. So now we're ready to move on to the highlights layer, which is this one here. And as you can see, we've got a lot of detail outside, which is great. However, the interior is very, very dark. For some of you to solve this, your go-to would be to use the flambient technique. So you might be bouncing a flash off of the back corner so that you're flooding the area with light. Now, while that does offer a convenient fix for brightening up the interior of the property, it also presents several issues that I'm not a big fan of, and this technique actually solves. So what are those issues? Well, if you're dealing with bigger spaces like this and bigger, which is often the case when you're doing architectural photography or bigger high-end homes, you'll find that just your speed lights aren't going to give you enough power, so you need a bigger light. This bad boy is actually the perfect balance between power and price. So if you are doing a lot of flambient work and flashes just aren't cutting the mustard, this is what I'd recommend, and it is the AD600 Pro. I'll put a link to it in the description below. This is excellent, and if you're into architectural photography, I strongly recommend getting a more powerful light in your gearbox. However, issues with the flambient technique aren't just reserved to the power of your strobe. There's also issues to do with reflections when you're bouncing the light around. Also, are you actually making the scene look believable with how you're bouncing the light? We have a stunning lounge here which actually looked amazing to my eye when I was there on site, and so really I don't need to augment what already looked great with some off-camera flash, because all the light was there. It's just my job as a photo editor to have the skill set to be able to manipulate what the camera captured to present to the viewer what we saw when we were there. And that's exactly what we're doing here. And once you understand the steps involved, it's really not that hard. So what do we need to do with this highlights layer to get it to blend in seamlessly with the base that we've already created, and do so that we can bring back our exterior without affecting what we've done to the base layer? Well, the key to success is twofold. We want to make sure that we have a lovely rich amount of information in the exterior, which we currently have. However, the thing that is the issue currently is that the interior is very dark. What you want to do is to try and match the interior brightness level as closely as you can to what you've created for your base. It's very easy to do, and a lot of people overlook this during their step. They try and blend these as they are. You need to adjust this highlights layer in the way that I'm going to show you. So let's select the highlights layer. jump over to the develop section and start making some changes. So the first thing I'd like to do is just brighten up the overall exposure, and now I'm going to grab the shadows and boost those up. And the fact that we're going to create a noisy file on the interior really doesn't bother me, because these aren't the pixels that are going to make up our final image. Our final image for the interior will be made up of these much cleaner pixels from the base layer, and also some from this shadow layer as well. So all I want to do when I'm working on this particular file to bring back the highlights outside is to make sure that the outside is looking good and got all of those highlight details, and also that we're not too dark on the interior. So I'm just going to grab the blacks and boost those up a little as well, maybe bring up the contrast, and I think just adding a little bit of clarity for the exterior will also help. If I press J on the keyboard, I can see that I am slightly blowing out those clouds, which I don't really want to do. So I'm just going to bring the whites down a little, and maybe also just drop that exposure level back just a little bit. Look, that should be okay. Let's just reduce the highlights again. Okay, that's pretty good. Now let's attack our third layer, which is going to be our brightest exposure. And this is the one that we're going to be using to bring back information in the very darkest shadows. The fact that we're overexposed really doesn't worry me. All I care about is areas in the very deepest shadows, because working with this file is what's going to give us the ability to bring back that information in those shadows. So the key to the blend here is making sure that the shadows are all visible and looking really good, but we also don't want to overexpose too much the highlights. We're not actually going to be using any of the highlight information from this layer, but by trying to better match this interior again, these brighter parts, with our base layer here, it's going to make for a much more believable blend in Photoshop. And again, that's where a lot of people come unstuck. So I'm just going to bring the black point up slightly, and let's also boost the shadows as well, just so that we're making sure that we are getting all of that lovely shadow detail. Things are a little washed out, so I'm just going to introduce a little bit of contrast as well, and probably just bring those blacks down just so that we are getting a true black point, because as we're using this to reintroduce the very darkest shadows, we don't want it to be washed out and tepid, and so therefore I'm just making sure that again we are touching pure black in the very darkest areas, indicated by these blue warnings which I've turned on here. Okay, let's have a quick look at our three files before we blend them in Photoshop. Here's our lovely base layer, which looks really nice for the interior, nice bit of contrast, but we're overexposed outside. Here we have our file, which is going to take care of that exterior. We're going to use that to bring back all of the detail in the windows and the highlights, but it's not going to affect the interior whatsoever. This third layer is what we're going to use to actually bring information and detail into those shadows, so that areas just around this little bit here, maybe even on the TV or the fireplace, we have details in the shadows in this particular file that we're able to use. So we've now done the hard work, the heavy lifting in Lightroom, and once you know what you're doing with moving those sliders around, that shouldn't take you more than like 20-30 seconds to get that whole set ready. And the next step is we need to load these files into Photoshop as layers. That's going to enable us to apply specific masks, that's going to bring back the highlights where we want them, the shadows where we want them, all over the top of that beautiful base layer. And the result is going to be a photo of the lounge that contains all that lovely high dynamic range that we were able to see with our eyes that the camera wasn't able to capture. So let's do it. So here we are with our three layers inside of Photoshop. We've got our base layer, we've got our layer designed to deal with the exterior, i.e. the highlights, and then we have our layer designed to help us show and reveal the shadows. So these are our three layers. Our base layer being the foundation of our finished photo, and these two extra layers are more supplementary. So we're going to steal little elements. So the highlights from this one is what we're going to steal, and then we're going to steal the shadows from this one and introduce those into the base layer to correct for its flaws. So how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to do it with masking. It's very simple masking, but it's also very specific masking. And so normally when we apply a mask, let's say we come down here and we're going to click on our mask to hide everything, and then with white we could start painting back in what we want to reveal. Now obviously this is a very crude method. This is not the way we want to do it, and if I hold Alt and click on the mask, you can see exactly what I've created here. It's no wonder that this doesn't look good. So how do we do this properly? Well, I'm going to delete that layer mask and show you a much better method. And in order to do this method successfully, I'm going to be using a panel called Lumenzia. I'll put a link to it in the description below. It is a paid product, but it's honestly like the best investment I've ever made in my architectural photography because of what it allows me to do. I think it's around, I'll check, Okay, it's currently $39, and I always put any purchase that I make for my photography business in perspective against what my earning potential is. So I charge between $85 and $115 per photo license that I'm sending to a client. So $39 to allow me to create the results that I need, it's a no-brainer for me. And so when you're considering what you buy for your business, I'd strongly recommend that you put it into that sort of perspective. You know, like this light, for example, is about $1,500. This lens, maybe $2,000. So you're talking thousands and thousands of dollars for your photography gear that you take out on site with you. So when you're investing in software, I always put it in perspective. So it always makes me laugh when people are like, oh, $100 for Luminar or whatever it is. Like, put it in perspective, particularly if you're a professional, in terms of what you spend on your gear, but more importantly, what return you're going to get on that investment. So let me show you how to use Lumenzia, because the results are mind-blowing of what it can actually do for you. Also, if you want to dig deeper into the topic of luminosity blending, Greg Benz also has a course available on Lumenzia and exposure blending, and it was what I actually learned all my techniques from. He's an excellent tutor. It's about $200, I think, so that is also well worth getting as well. I'll put a link to all of this in the description below, but some of the best money I've invested in myself. Okay, let me open up the Lumenzia panel, and it looks pretty confusing at first glance, but there's literally only 3 buttons that we need, and that is this L, this D, and the mask button. That's it. So the first thing we want to do is make sure that we have the exterior layer selected, but we want to hide it. And now all we're going to do is come up and press the L, which refers to lights. So we're selecting the light pixels. So now Lumenzia has run some calculations, and it's given us a preview of the mask. So we can see that white reveals and black conceals. So basically anywhere that's white is going to show our exterior layer. So all of those highlights outside are going to be revealed. Things are going to be hidden from the layer here in these darkest areas, and we're probably going to pick up some through these midtones here. So if you want to refine your mask, which I do here, because we don't really want to be introducing this exterior layer up here on the ceiling, so what we can do is just grab this little slider on the right hand side, pull it down a little bit, and we can actually start to get more specific with our mask. And it's keeping these very bright bits outside the window, but it's masking more of the interior. So I'm not going to go too extreme with that. Having a subtle fall off is pretty much perfect. And once you're happy with your mask, all we need to do is just click this mask button right here. It's going to apply that mask preview onto the layer itself. And now when we toggle the layer's eye icon, we will see all of those bright pixels reintroduced outside of the windows. However, there is an issue with it at the moment. You will see that we're also losing a little bit of contrast on the interior, and that is because you can see in this mask, anywhere that's not pure black, we are introducing the pixels from this exterior layer, and that's not really what we want. We only want it through where the windows are, and that's a really easy fix. All we need to do now is just double mask this, and this is one of my favorite techniques. All we do is create a group that we're just going to hold one layer in that group. I know it sounds crazy making a group, but it's only got one thing in. But what that's going to allow us to do is actually add another mask to this. And so I'm going to hold the Alt key and click on the mask. That gives me a black mask, so it's going to hide everything. I'm going to drop my opacity of the brush to about 50% so that I can now come in and just paint in that effect, and I'm going to be able to build this up. So all I'm doing is just painting over the windows, and the fact that we're getting a little bit of a bleed over the interior of the room, I'm not worried about. I'm going to shrink my brush down in size a little bit, and I'm going to come in and just paint these windows again. Basically anywhere where there's a highlight and you want to bring it down, we can now just roughly paint over that area. If we want to get things done a little quicker, let's just put that on 100% and just really quickly dab on each pane of glass, particularly in the center. And now if we toggle that off and after, you can see that we're bringing back all of those highlight details out of the window without compromising any of the contrast values inside the interior of our room. And if we want to brighten up those dark areas of the photos, we can use this shadows layer here, which is going to bring in some really nice clean pixels for those very darkest areas. And so to do that, again, it's really easy. All we're going to do is just hide the layer temporarily, and we're going to come over, and this time we're going to press the D, which stands for darks. And now Lumenzia has created a mask based on the darkest pixels. However, this isn't actually what I'm after. Because we've got the highlights shown, we're also masking based on those highlights. I'm not interested in that. It's just the interior I care about. And so I'm just going to as well temporarily hide that layer there, and you can see how that has just changed the mask instantaneously. So all of a sudden out of the window it's pure black, so we're not going to be bringing any of those shadow pixels back in outside the window. And again, that is exactly what we want. We just want it boosting up the shadows on the interior. And so if we're happy with this look, and again we could move this slider to refine the mask, but for simplicity's sake I'm just going to say I'm happy with that. Click the mask button. Now the mask has been created. I'm first of all going to turn on those highlights again, and now we're going to turn on those shadows. So there you go, we've brightened up that interior. But just like before when we used the group and we had a secondary mask to control exactly where we wanted to apply the highlights, we can do the same with the shadows. So I may not want to introduce the brightening of the shadows everywhere because it does start to flatten the image out. And so I'm going to be more selective with that by roughly painting it in now. And I can do that by creating another group, grab those shadows, put that inside that group, and now I can create a secondary mask. I'm going to hold the Alt key and click on the mask. That's going to hide everything from that shadow layer. And now I'm going to repaint in the shadows where I want them, but it's only going to reveal them based on this really defined mask that Lumenzia has created. Because we're working with a black mask which is hiding everything currently, I'm going to use white to paint back in. So I'm just going to toggle those over. So I'm using my white paintbrush, and instead of being aggressive with 100%, I'm just going to build it up. So we'll set the opacity at about 50%. And now I'm just going to start painting only where I want to brighten up. So I may want to brighten up, say, the left of the TV a little more than the right, because that's already quite bright. The back and the side of the couch here, this is very dark, and so I do want to brighten up these areas around here. So I'm just going to click, paint in some of that brighter pixels into those dark areas, and I can also do the same on the floor as well, just to brighten up the timber on the floor and help lead our eye into the center of the frame. Okay, let's have a look at our before and our after. Before and after is pretty subtle, but it is an improvement. So now let's just jump back to our original and where we got to. So I'll name those groups and just collapse them. And so we'll hide the layer that brightens the shadows and hide the highlights as well. And you can see that we're back to our original. And now, if you feel like these highlights are just a little bit too dark, it's not that believable, and you'll see this all the time in real estate photo editing, that the exterior is just too dark, what we can do is come back to the opacity, and we don't have to have that set 100%. We could drop it back, say, to 75% or 88. You know, you don't need to have that smashed all the way to 100 and being that aggressive with it. After all, the outside of the property is brighter, so there's no harm in having the pixels that represent out of the window brighter than what's going on in the interior, but as long as we can see them and they're not completely blown out like they were originally. And now if we reintroduce the shadows, our level of detail through the whole photo is greatly improved. And that is so much better. However, there is a big drawback about taking a very contrasty scene and compressing those highlights down, bring the shadows up. Basically, you're going to end up with all of that information, but the consequence is oftentimes the contrast is going to be greatly reduced. And so as a finishing touch, we need to reintroduce that contrast. If you're familiar with the basic S-curve, absolutely that is a way that you can reintroduce contrast into your photos. However, we want to make sure we're delivering our client the very best file possible. So I'm going to let you in on the secret sauce that I apply to my photos to reintroduce contrast, but not just that, really bring out a level of detail that the architects really appreciate. So let me show you. Okay, I'm going for the monster shortcut, Control Alt Shift and E, and that is going to create a stamped visible layer. So now all of that hard work exists on its own individual layer. I'm going to come up to my filters menu and I'm going to apply one of my favorite filters, and that is Nik Collection's Color Effects Pro. It's currently on version 5. I'll put a link to whatever the best price is for it in the description below, and literally it's a way for you to add detail and add contrast. Like I say, super easy to use. Basically, we can come in, I've got 3 filters applied here. I won't go over it in a whole heap of detail here, but literally I can enhance the detail with this detail extractor tool. I have that set to 7%. I also love this Pro contrast tool. I'm going to turn that on, and just like that, all of that contrast that we started to lose through our luminosity blend, that is reintroduced, and we can have a play around with this. Look, if I push this all the way aggressively to 100, you can see that you can get some really punchy results. Obviously you want to be a little bit more refined with how you use this, and as a final touch, a rather unexpected tool that I love to use is the Glamour Glow. It's not even in the normal filters section under architecture, it's actually under portrait, a Glamour Glow, but I just feel that this actually gives it a nice soft kind of look. So it's not much, but look, here's 𝗥𝗲𝗄𝗏, things are getting a little bit crunchy, and just by adding a little bit of this glow, not too much, you can just soften it up and it gives it a nice kind of ethereal and inviting kind of look. So now if we toggle from our before to our after with Color Effects Pro applied, we've got a nice amount of contrast going on now. We've got a little bit more detail going on in the textures. And if I zoom in and we look at the before and after, you can see that we've got that contrast. We've got a lovely, rich amount of detail going on now as well. It's pretty subtle, but it really gives your photos a lovely lift. And obviously, you don't have to use it 100% across the whole photo. We could mask this in so that we can draw the viewer's attention to exactly where we want it. So we can apply it more heavily towards the center of the frame, and that just gives us a little pop into the lounge area without adding unwanted contrast to the ceiling. So with just two really powerful techniques, we've been able to take the photograph from this and turn it into this. To finish the photo, I'd probably just neutralize those whites, which incidentally you can also do in Color Effects Pro, and I'd also remove those little dust sensor spots that you may have noticed on the ceiling as well. But in terms of just two very simple yet very, very powerful techniques, luminosity blending, it is an absolute game changer. Thoroughly recommend Lumenzia to help you with that, and also Color Effects Pro just to bring back that localized contrast. Way better than messing around with curves in Photoshop. It's really going to elevate your work, so it looks so good. Okay, thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget those links are in the description below if you're interested in getting hold of some of these to help you with your workflow, and I will see you in the next video. Let me know what else you want to learn and I'll see if I can cover it. Cheers for watching. Bye bye for now.